The silence was the first thing I bought. It came with the peeling paint on the farmhouse, the 50 acres of sun-scorched grass, and a barn that leaned with the weary posture of a tired old man. In the city, silence was a commodity, something you paid for with triple-paned windows and noise-canceling headphones. Out here, it was the default setting. A thick, ringing emptiness that pressed in on you, filling the spaces where traffic and sirens and the murmur of a million other lives used to be. For the first month, I thought it was peace. By the third, I understood it was just a different kind of noise, the sound of my own loneliness echoing back at me. My life in Chicago had been a monument to carefully curated surfaces. A minimalist apartment with concrete floors, a graphic design job that paid for my expensive, joyless furniture, and a series of relationships that were more about aesthetic compatibility than actual connection. I had fled that life thinking I was running towards something authentic, something real. I imagined myself as a rugged homesteader, rising with the sun, my hands calloused from honest work. The reality was me, in my overpriced flannel shirt, staring at a field of weeds and a fence that looked like a line of broken teeth, with absolutely no idea where to begin. My hands were soft. My spirit was softer. The final humiliation came in the form of a single, rust-colored cow. It belonged to my nearest neighbor, a man named Henderson who lived a mile down the dirt road. The cow, possessing more ambition than I did, had simply walked through a collapsed section of my fence and started chewing on the overgrown mess I called a lawn. Henderson had been polite about it, but his eyes, crinkled and knowing, had sized up my city boots and clean jeans. "Gonna need a hand with that," he'd said, not as a question, but as a verdict. And so, I found myself typing up an ad, the words feeling foreign and absurd on my laptop screen. Ranch hand needed. General repairs, fencing, basic land management. Experience required. It felt like placing a personal ad for a version of myself I had failed to become. I posted it on the bulletin board at the dusty general store in the nearest town, a place that smelled of sawdust and coffee that had been on the burner since dawn. I felt like a fraud, my car key fob with its panic button feeling obscene next to the faded flyers for church potlucks and lost dogs. A week passed. The cow did not return, but its ghost haunted me, a symbol of my incompetence. I spent my days wandering the property, making lists of tasks I couldn't complete, the silence growing louder with every unhammered nail. I was just about to give up, to call a contractor from the city and pay an obscene amount of money to have my rustic dreams sanitized and managed by professionals, when a truck rumbled up my driveway. It was an old Ford, the color of a faded sky, with a patina of dust and dents that spoke of years of actual work. It parked, and the engine cut out, leaving the world to the sound of cicadas and my own suddenly frantic heartbeat. A man unfolded himself from the driver's seat. He was tall, built with a kind of dense solidity that seemed to anchor him to the ground. He wore a worn denim shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing arms corded with muscle and dusted with fine, sun-bleached hair. His jeans were faded and fit him in a way that was purely practical, yet devastatingly effective. He walked toward the porch where I stood, his boots crunching on the gravel with a slow, deliberate rhythm. He wasn't hurrying. He didn't seem to hurry for anything. As he got closer, I saw his face. It was all angles and planes, tanned by the sun, with a strong jaw that was covered in a day's worth of dark stubble. But it was his eyes that stopped me. They were a deep, clear brown, and they were steady. Unreadable. They weren't hostile, or friendly, or curious. They just were. They saw. "Saw your ad at the store," he said. His voice was low, a gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the dry air. It wasn't loud, but it carried, cutting through the silence without disturbing it. "Right. Yes. The ad." I stammered, feeling my cheeks flush. I felt flimsy and translucent under that gaze. A man made of paper next to a man made of oak. "I'm Cole," he said. He didn't offer a hand, just gave a slight nod. "Leo," I managed. He looked past me, his eyes scanning the dilapidated fence line, the sagging porch roof, the barn door hanging drunkenly from a single hinge. He took it all in, his expression unchanging. There was no judgment, just a quiet assessment. It was somehow more unnerving than open criticism. He was like a force of nature, a river or a mountain, that didn't need to have an opinion of you. It simply existed, and you had to deal with it. Lot of work, he stated. Again, not a question. Yes, it is. More than I anticipated, my attempt at a wry, self-deprecating smile felt weak and foolish. It didn't even register on his face. He walked the perimeter of the house, his long strides eating up the ground. I followed a few paces behind, feeling like a nervous child trailing after a parent. He stopped at the broken fence, grabbing a loose post and testing it. The wood crumbled in his grip. He rubbed the rotten pulp between his thumb and forefinger, his gaze distant, already solving a problem I hadn't even properly identified. He didn't speak for a long time. The silence stretched, and I felt compelled to fill it with nervous chatter, to explain my vision for the place, to justify my existence here. But I didn't. Something about his presence commanded quiet. It was a silence that wasn't empty, but full of thought. His thought. Finally, he turned back to me. I can fix it, he said. The fence first. Then the barn. Porch needs new footings. He laid out the next 6 months of my life in 3 declarative sentences. Okay, I said, my voice barely a whisper. What's your rate? He named a number. It was fair, almost suspiciously so. I had been expecting to be taken advantage of, the city boy with a wallet and no skills. All right, when can you start? I asked, bracing myself for a long wait. Tomorrow, he said, turning and walking back toward his truck. Sunrise. And that was it. No handshake. No paperwork. Just a statement of fact. He got in his truck, the engine turned over with a familiar grumble, and he drove away, leaving me standing in a cloud of dust and a profound sense of having just been fundamentally altered. The silence that rushed back in felt different. It was no longer just my own. It felt like it was waiting for him, waiting for sunrise. The first week was an exercise in observation. I told myself it was responsible oversight, the diligence of an employer, but I knew it was something else. I'd make coffee in the kitchen, my hands wrapped around the warm mug, and I'd just watch him from the window. He arrived each morning as the sky was turning from bruised purple to pale orange, his truck appearing at the end of the long driveway like a promise. He worked with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. There were no wasted steps, no hesitant gestures. Every swing of the sledgehammer, every turn of the auger, was precise and final. He was rebuilding the fence line, starting with the section Henderson's cow had breached. He moved down the property line, a solitary, methodical figure against the vast, empty landscape. He pulled the old, rotten post from the earth with a grunt of effort, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching under his shirt. He set the new posts, his body a study in leverage and control, tamping the earth around them until they stood as straight and unmovable as he was. I watched the way the sun caught the sweat on his neck, the way he would occasionally pause to wipe his brow with the back of a gloved hand, his eyes scanning the horizon. I started finding excuses to be outside. I'd take my laptop onto the porch, pretending to work, just to be closer to the rhythmic sounds of his labor, the thud of the post driver, the creak of wire being stretched taut, the low curse when a staple refused to bite into the wood. He rarely acknowledged me beyond a curt nod in the morning. He didn't seem to need conversation. He was self-contained, a closed circuit of purpose and action. My own life, my own work, felt frivolous in comparison. I was moving pixels around on a screen, crafting elegant lies for corporate clients, while he was physically reordering a piece of the world, making something broken whole again. The disconnect was jarring. I felt like a ghost in my own home, a spectator to the real, tangible life happening just beyond my window. My internal monologue, however, was anything but quiet. It was a frantic, desperate attempt to decipher the man in my yard. Every glance, every gesture was put under a microscope. One afternoon, I brought him a glass of water. It was a sweltering day, the heat shimmering off the fields. He was shirtless, his back a landscape of muscle and sun-browned skin, glistening with sweat. I felt my throat go dry. "Thought you might be thirsty," I said, my voice sounding thin. He turned, his eyes squinting against the sun. He took the glass from me, his calloused fingers brushing against mine. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt straight through me, a sudden, sharp spike of awareness. It was like touching a live wire. My skin tingled where he'd made contact. "Thanks," he said, his voice a low rasp. He drank the entire glass in one long, slow pull, his throat working. A drop of water escaped the corner of his mouth and traced a path down his stubbled chin, disappearing into the dark hair on his chest. I couldn't look away. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He handed the empty glass back. For a fraction of a second, his gaze held mine. It wasn't unreadable anymore. There was something in it, a flicker of something. It wasn't curiosity, not exactly. It was a deeper kind of seeing. It felt as if, for that one moment, he saw past the city boy playing farmer and saw the lonely, yearning man underneath. Then it was gone, the shutter falling back into place. He gave a slight nod, turned, and went back to his work. I retreated to the house, my legs unsteady. I leaned against the kitchen counter, the cool stone a welcome shock against my heated skin. I replayed the moment over and over. The brush of his fingers, the look in his eyes. Was I imagining it? Projecting my own desperate loneliness onto this quiet, solitary man? It was possible. It was likely. My mind was a fertile ground for fantasies, for building elaborate structures of hope on the flimsiest of foundations. He was just my ranch hand, a straight man doing a job. The physical intimacy of his presence, the casual way he inhabited his body, was just a fact of his existence, not an invitation. I knew this. I told myself this, repeating it like a mantra. But my body, my traitorous heart, refused to listen. It had been so long since I had felt that spark, that dangerous, thrilling current of attraction. I had forgotten how it could hijack your entire system, turning every mundane moment into something fraught with meaning. The days bled into weeks. The fence was completed, a strong, perfect line enclosing my property, defining my space in the world. It felt like he had built a fortress around me. Now, he was starting on the barn. The work was louder, more complex. The screech of rusted metal being pried loose, the percussive blast of a nail gun, the whine of a circular saw. He moved with the same deliberate grace, climbing ladders, balancing on rafters, his body silhouetted against the bright blue sky. I fell into a routine. I'd make a pot of coffee in the morning and leave a thermos for him on the porch railing. At lunch, I'd make sandwiches and leave them on a plate by the barn door. I never stayed. I'd just leave the offerings and retreat, watching from a distance as he would eventually stop, sit on an overturned bucket in the shade of the barn, and eat. We never spoke of it. It was a silent transaction, a rhythm we had established without words. It was my way of participating, of contributing something tangible, however small. It was my way of saying thank you. It was my way of saying I see you. One evening, he worked later than usual. A storm was rolling in from the west, the sky turning a bruised, heavy gray. The wind picked up, rattling the old windows of the farmhouse and whipping through the tall grass. I was getting anxious, watching the sky darken, the first fat drops of rain splattering against the glass. He was on the barn roof, trying to secure a loose sheet of tin that was flapping violently in the wind. I couldn't just watch. I grabbed a heavy wrench from the toolbox I'd bought, but barely touched, and went outside. The wind tore at my clothes, and the rain was coming down harder now, cold and sharp. "Cole," I yelled up at him. "It's not safe. Come down." He glanced down, his hair plastered to his forehead, his face set in a look of grim determination. He shook his head, pointing at the flapping metal. "It'll tear the whole roof off if I don't fix it," he shouted back, his voice nearly lost in the rising howl of the wind. My fear for his safety overrode my usual timidity. I found the ladder he'd been using and, without a second thought, started to climb. It was slick with rain, and the wind tried to pry my fingers from the rungs. By the time I reached the roof, I was soaked and trembling, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He looked surprised to see me. "What are you doing? Get down." "I'm helping," I yelled, crawling carefully across the steep pitch of the roof toward him. I handed him the wrench. "Tell me what to do." For a moment, he just stared at me. The rain was streaming down our faces, the world a chaotic symphony of wind and thunder. And in the middle of it, his expression softened. The hard lines of his face eased, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It was the first real smile I had ever seen from him. It transformed his entire face, lighting him up from the inside. "Hold this damn thing steady," he grunted, positioning the loose tin. "Don't let it go. We work together, a clumsy but determined team." I held the metal sheet down with all my weight while he fought to tighten the bolts. The wind shrieked, the rain fell in blinding sheets, and lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating us in a stark, flickering strobe. In that moment, we weren't employer and employee, city boy and ranch hand. We were just two men on a roof in a storm, holding on for dear life, working toward a common goal. A strange sense of elation filled me. We were a team. When the last bolt was tightened, we scrambled back toward the ladder, half crawling, half sliding down the slick roof. We stumbled into the relative shelter of the barn, dripping and gasping for breath. The raw power of the storm outside made the cavernous space feel like a sanctuary. The air smelled of hay, old wood, and rain. We stood there for a moment in the dim light, our chests heaving, water sluicing from our hair and clothes. I was shaking, partly from cold, partly from the leftover adrenaline. Cole reached out and put a hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, steadying. "You're okay," he said, his voice low and calm. It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to speak. His hand was so warm. The heat of it seemed to seep through my wet shirt, spreading through my entire body, a welcome fire against the chill. He didn't remove it. His thumb began to move in a slow, circular motion against my shoulder blade. It was a small, almost unconscious gesture, but it felt earth-shatteringly intimate. It was a touch of comfort, of care. I looked up at him. His face was close, his eyes dark and serious in the gloom. The storm raged outside, a distant, muffled roar. But inside the barn, a different kind of storm was brewing, a quiet, intense turbulence in the space between us. I could feel the pull of it, the gravity of his presence. I could smell the rain on his skin, mixed with the faint, masculine scent of sweat, and something else, something uniquely him. Cedar and earth. He was looking at my mouth. I know he was. I watched his gaze drop from my eyes to my lips, and it lingered there for a beat too long. My own breath hitched in my chest. This is it. This is the moment. The world seemed to slow down, to narrow to this single point in time, to the inches that separated us. Then, a flash of lightning illuminated the barn, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the very foundations of the building. The moment shattered. Cole flinched back, dropping his hand from my shoulder as if he'd been burned. The connection was broken. He took a half step away, running a hand through his wet hair, suddenly looking awkward and out of place. "We should get inside," he said, his voice rough. He wouldn't meet my eyes. The spell was broken. We walked back to the house in a tense, crackling silence that had nothing to do with the lightning. I offered him a towel and a dry shirt, one of my own that was far too big for me but would have to do. He took them with a muttered, "Thanks," and disappeared into the guest bathroom. While he was gone, I stood in the living room, my mind racing. I wasn't imagining it. I couldn't have been. That moment on the roof, the look in the barn, the touch. It was real. The air between us had changed. The carefully constructed boundary of our professional relationship had been washed away by the storm, leaving something raw and uncertain in its place. He came back out wearing my gray t-shirt. It was stretched tight across his broad shoulders and chest, the fabric clinging in a way that was both comical and incredibly distracting. He looked like a superhero stuffed into civilian clothes. He still wouldn't look at me directly. He stood by the door, his wet boots leaving puddles on the floorboards. "I should go," he said, his gaze fixed on some point over my shoulder. "The storm's letting up." "Don't be ridiculous," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "You can't drive in this. The road will be a river of mud. Stay? You can take the guest room." The offer hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken implications. He hesitated for a long moment. I could see the conflict in his face, the desire to flee versus the practical reality of the situation. Finally, he gave a short, reluctant nod. "All right, just till it clears." I made coffee, needing something to do with my hands. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. Every clink of a mug, every drip of the coffee maker, seemed amplified. We sat at the small kitchen table, the storm still rumbling outside, two strangers who had suddenly become far too intimate. I searched for something to say, some neutral topic to bridge the chasm that had opened up between us. "Thank you," I said finally, "for fixing the roof. For everything." He just nodded, staring down into his coffee mug as if it held the answers to the universe. Then he surprised me. He looked up, and his eyes were clear, his expression open for the first time. "You get lonely out here, Leo?" he asked, his voice quiet. The question was so direct, so unexpected, that it knocked the breath out of me. It was the same question he could have asked after the first storm, the one that had broken through his stoic shell. He was circling back to it, to that moment of vulnerability. It was an offering, a real question that demanded a real answer. "Yeah," I admitted, my voice thick. "I do. All the time." He held my gaze, and I saw a flicker of something I recognized. It was a reflection of my own solitude. In that moment, I understood that his silence wasn't about aloofness or disinterest. It was a shield, same as my city-bred sarcasm had been. He was lonely, too. The quiet, capable man who could fix anything seemed to be just as broken on the inside as I was. We sat there in a comfortable silence for a long time after that, drinking our coffee, while the storm slowly spent its fury outside. We didn't need to talk anymore. A different kind of understanding had passed between us. We were two solitary men who had, for a brief, terrifying moment in a barn, seen the truth of each other. The question was, what would we do with it now? The days that followed were excruciatingly polite. Cole would arrive at sunrise, nod, and go directly to the barn. I would leave his thermos and his lunch in their designated spots. We avoided any possibility of accidental touch, of prolonged eye contact. We had retreated to our respective corners, the memory of that night in the barn a tangible, shimmering presence between us. It was a wall of unspoken things, more solid than any fence he could build. He finished the barn repairs, his work as impeccable as ever. The door now slid open smoothly on its track. The roof was watertight. The structure was sound. He started on the porch next. The rhythmic thud of his hammer was the soundtrack to my anxious, looping thoughts. I watched him from the living room window, a pane of glass separating our worlds. He was replacing the rotten support posts, his movements sure and strong. I found myself memorizing the way he moved, the set of his shoulders as he lifted a heavy beam, the concentration etched on his face as he measured a cut. My yearning was a physical ache, a constant, low-grade fever that I couldn't shake. I felt like a starving man watching a feast through a window. The tension was becoming unbearable. It was in the air we breathed, in the too long pauses, in the way we carefully navigated the space around each other. Something had to give. I knew it, but I was too much of a coward to be the one to push. I was terrified of misreading everything, of destroying the quiet, respectful dynamic we had managed to rebuild. To lose his presence in my life entirely would be worse than this limbo. The tipping point came, as it so often does, not with a bang, but with a flicker. It was a Tuesday evening in late August. A heat wave had settled over the valley, thick and oppressive. The air was still and heavy, promising a thunderstorm that refused to break. Cole had stayed late again, trying to finish bracing the new porch roof before the predicted storm hit. He was working on the electrical, trying to fix the old, faulty wiring for the porch light. I was in the kitchen, trying to find the energy to make dinner, the air thick with the scent of ozone and unspent lightning. And then the lights flickered. Once, twice. They held for a moment, a sickly, buzzing yellow, and then they died completely. The hum of the refrigerator cut out. The digital clock on the oven went dark. The house was plunged into a sudden, shocking silence and an even more shocking darkness. My heart leaped into my throat. The sun had set, and without the artificial glow of electricity, the night outside was absolute. "Leo." Cole's voice came from the direction of the porch, deeper and closer than I expected. "I'm here," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "In the kitchen. The power's out." I heard his heavy boots on the porch boards, then the creak of the front door. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy in the dark. I finally managed to turn on the flashlight, its thin, sterile beam cutting a nervous path through the gloom. I found him in the hallway. He was just a silhouette against the faint, dying light from the doorway. "Breaker?" I asked, my voice small. "Doubt it," he said. He walked past me, his shoulder brushing mine in the narrow space. The familiar jolt went through me, sharper this time in the dark. Whole grid's probably down. This heat. Everyone's running their AC. He went to the breaker box by the back door and flipped the switches anyway. "Nothing." "Yeah, we're dark." He sounded so calm, so capable, while I was on the verge of a low-grade panic. He was simply diagnosing the problem. He turned to me, his face half lit by the glow of my phone. "You got candles? A lantern?" "I think there are some candles in a drawer somewhere," I said, my mind racing. "And maybe an old lantern in the basement. I saw it when I first moved in." "Basement's better," he said decisively. "I'll go." He took the phone from my hand, his fingers warm against mine, and started toward the basement door. I stood frozen in the kitchen, listening to his footsteps descending the creaky wooden stairs. The darkness he left behind felt absolute, a living thing. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the frantic thumping of my own heart. I was alone in the dark, and it felt like all my carefully constructed walls were dissolving around me. After a few minutes, which felt like an eternity, I saw a faint, warm glow begin to emanate from the basement doorway. It grew stronger, and then he appeared, carrying an old kerosene lantern. The flame inside cast a flickering, golden light, painting the room in moving shadows. It was a warm, alive light, completely different from the cold, clinical beam of my phone. It made the familiar lines of my kitchen seem ancient and mysterious. Cole's face was transformed by the light. The flames danced in his dark eyes, carving his features into stark relief. He looked like a figure from another time, rugged and elemental. He placed the lantern on the kitchen table, and the circle of light pushed the oppressive darkness back, creating a small island of warmth and safety in the center of the room. He looked at me, his gaze direct and intense. The nervous energy, the polite distance of the past weeks, had vanished. The power outage had stripped away all pretense. We were back in the storm, but this time it was a storm of silence, of heat, of suffocating proximity. "Generators shot," he said, his voice a low rumble that filled the quiet space. "Tried to get it going earlier. Fuel lines clogged." "Oh," I said, the single word feeling pitifully inadequate. My mind was blank. All I could focus on was him. The way the lantern light caught the line of his jaw, the way his shadow danced on the wall behind him, huge and protective. He took a step closer, into the small circle of my personal space. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, held captive by his gravity. He was so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I could smell the scent of his skin, of honest sweat and sawdust, and the faint, clean smell of soap. He looked around the darkened room. Then his eyes settled back on me. They held an unreadable expression, a mixture of concern and something else, something deeper and more intense. He reached out, not to touch me, but just to gesture at the encompassing darkness beyond our small circle of light. "It'll be a while," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Storm's coming. They won't get a crew out here till morning, maybe longer." I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. My entire world had shrunk to the space of this kitchen, to this small circle of flickering light, to the man standing in front of me. The air was thick with unspoken words, with weeks of unresolved tension. It was all here, in the dark, with us. He looked at me for a long, silent moment. I felt completely exposed, as if the lantern light was stripping away all my layers, leaving my lonely, yearning heart bare for him to see. I thought he would turn away, would suggest we find the candles and retreat to separate rooms. But he didn't. He held my gaze, and his voice was low and steady, a command that was also a comfort. "Stay close," he said. And my world stopped turning. Stay close. 2 simple words. A practical instruction in a dark house. But it wasn't practical. It was everything else. It was an admission, an invitation. It was the closing of a distance I had thought was unbridgeable. It was him, finally, reaching across the divide. The subtext was a deafening roar in the sudden silence of the house. He wasn't talking about the darkness. He was talking about us. I couldn't breathe. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. I stared at him, searching his face in the flickering light for any sign that I was wrong, that I was once again building a fantasy out of nothing. But his expression was deadly serious. His eyes were dark pools, and in their depths, I saw the same vulnerability, the same raw need that I felt reflected in my own. He didn't move. He just stood there, waiting for me. The choice was mine. I could make a joke, break the tension, and retreat back into the safety of our established roles. Or I could step forward, into the terrifying, beautiful unknown that he was offering. My body moved before my mind did. I took a single, shaky step forward, closing the last bit of distance between us. I was inside his space now, so close that the fabric of his shirt brushed against my chest. I lifted my head and met his gaze. The world outside, the storm, the power outage, it all faded away. There was only the golden light of the lantern and the man in front of me. Cole, I whispered, his name a prayer on my lips. And that was all it took. The rigid control he held over himself seemed to snap. His hands came up to cup my face, his palms rough and calloused against my skin, his thumbs stroking my cheekbones with a tenderness that made my knees weak. His eyes searched mine, a silent question in their depths. I gave him the answer with a slight nod, a surrender. He leaned in, and his lips met mine. It wasn't a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of certainty, of weeks of pent-up longing and unspoken words. It was firm and deep and breathtakingly honest. His lips were soft, a startling contrast to the rough stubble that scraped gently against my skin. He tasted of coffee and the faint, metallic tang of the coming rain. I melted into him, my hands coming up to grip his strong biceps. He wrapped his arms around me, one hand splayed across the small of my back, pulling me tight against his solid frame. I could feel the hard muscle of his chest, the steady, powerful beat of his heart against mine. He was real. This was real. It was a kiss that wasn't rushed. It was slow and deep and thorough. It was a conversation without words. He was telling me everything he hadn't been able to say, and I was answering him back. I see you. I want you. I'm here. When he finally, reluctantly, broke the kiss, he didn't move away. He rested his forehead against mine, our breath mingling in the small space between us. I kept my eyes closed, trying to commit every sensation to memory. The scrape of his stubble, the scent of his skin, the solid feel of his body against mine. Leo, he murmured, his voice thick and rough. I opened my eyes. His were just inches from mine, dark and intense. The stoic mask was gone completely. In its place was a raw, aching vulnerability that mirrored my own. I saw the fear there, the same fear I felt, but I also saw a fierce, undeniable need. I'm not imagining this, am I? I whispered, the words fragile in the quiet room. He gave a short, rough laugh, a sound of pure relief. No, he said, his voice husky. You're not imagining this. He leaned in and kissed me again, softer this time, a kiss of reassurance, of sealing a promise. It was gentle and searching, and it made my heart ache with a feeling so potent it was almost painful. It was hope. We didn't speak for a long time after that. There was nothing to say. We just stood in the middle of the kitchen, holding each other in the warm, flickering light of the lantern as the storm finally broke outside. The first rumbles of thunder sounded in the distance, and the wind began to howl. But inside our small circle of light, we were safe. We were anchored. For the first time since I had moved into this lonely house, I wasn't afraid of the storm. I felt like I had finally come home. We spent the night in the living room. We brought the lantern in and set it on the hearth, its golden light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. We didn't talk much. We didn't have to. The silence between us was no longer fraught with tension and unspoken questions. It was filled with a quiet, profound understanding. We sat on the couch, not even touching at first, just existing in this new reality we had created. The storm raged outside, a wild and fitting soundtrack to the cataclysm that had occurred in my quiet, orderly life. Eventually, he lay down, stretching his long frame out on the couch, and he tugged me down with him. I rested my head on his chest, my ear pressed against the solid wall of it, listening to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart. His arm was a heavy, warm weight around my shoulders, holding me securely. He smelled of rain and sawdust and the clean, masculine scent of his own skin. I inhaled deeply, trying to brand the scent into my memory. His fingers idly stroked my hair, a simple, comforting gesture that spoke volumes. I had never felt so safe, so completely at peace. I fell asleep like that, lulled by the sound of his heartbeat and the drumming of the rain on the roof. I woke to silence, a deep, profound silence that was different from the one I had grown used to. The storm had passed. The house was still dark, but a pale, pre-dawn light was filtering through the windows, turning the world outside a soft, hazy gray. For a moment, I was disoriented. Then the memories of the night before came rushing back, The power outage, the lantern, the kiss, the feel of Cole's arms around me. I shifted, and my head was no longer on his chest. It was on a cushion. I sat up, my heart beginning to pound with a familiar, sickening dread. The couch beside me was empty. The afghan that had been draped over us was neatly folded on the armrest. The lantern was gone from the hearth. He was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. It was a dream, a desperate, lonely fantasy cooked up by my starved imagination. Or worse, it was real, and he regretted it. He had woken up in the cold light of day, horrified by what he had done, and he had slipped away in the darkness, leaving me to face the morning and my own foolishness alone. The silence of the house was no longer peaceful. It was mocking. It was the sound of my loneliness, returned and amplified. I scrambled off the couch, my bare feet cold on the wooden floor. I looked around the dim living room, searching for any sign of him. His boots were gone from the hallway. My stomach clenched. I walked through the quiet house, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The guest room door was open, the bed untouched. The bathroom was empty. He was gone. He had left. I felt a wave of despair so profound it threatened to buckle my knees. How could I have been so stupid? To believe that a man like him, a man so solid and real, could ever want someone like me, someone so flimsy. I had let my yearning blind me. I had seen what I wanted to see in the flickering, romantic light of a lantern. I ended up in the kitchen. The room looked mundane and ordinary in the gray morning light. The magic was gone. It was just a kitchen, the scene of my greatest humiliation. I leaned against the counter, the same spot where I had stood after he had first touched me, and pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, trying to block out the image of his face, the memory of his kiss. It was too painful. Then I heard it, a faint creak from outside, the sound of the porch swing, moving gently back and forth. My head snapped up. I moved to the window, my heart hammering against my ribs, a wild, hopeful bird. And I saw him. He was sitting on the porch swing, a steaming mug in his hands, watching the sun begin to rise over the distant hills. The sky was awash with pale pinks and soft oranges, the world washed clean by the storm. He wasn't gone. He was right there. Relief washed over me, so potent and overwhelming that I felt lightheaded. He hadn't left. I took a deep, shaky breath and pushed open the back door. The air was cool and crisp, smelling of damp earth and clean rain. He turned his head as I stepped out onto the porch. His expression was calm, his eyes clear. There was no sign of regret or panic in his face. He held up a second mug that had been sitting on the porch railing beside him. "There's coffee," he said, his voice a low, morning rumble. I took the mug, my fingers trembling slightly. The ceramic was warm. I wrapped my hands around it, letting the heat seep into my cold skin. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, my mind a blank slate of relief and uncertainty. I sat down on the swing next to him, careful to leave a few inches of space between us. The awkwardness was back, a fragile barrier. We sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the sun climb higher, painting the clouds in brilliant colors. "I thought you'd left," I said finally, the words quiet, barely disturbing the morning air. I stared down into my coffee, unable to look at him. He was silent for a long moment. Then he shifted on the swing, turning to face me. "Why would I leave?" he asked, his voice gentle. I risked a glance at him. He was watching me with a soft, searching expression. "I don't know," I whispered, shamefaced. "I thought maybe you regretted it." He let out a slow breath. "Leo," he said, and the way he said my name, so full of warmth and patience, made my eyes burn. "Look at me." I forced myself to meet his gaze. "The only thing I regret," he said slowly, his eyes holding mine, "is that I didn't do that weeks ago." He reached across the small space between us and took my hand. His fingers were warm and strong as they laced through mine. His thumb stroked the back of my hand, a simple, deliberate gesture of reassurance. I slept better last night than I have in years. And just like that, the fear, the doubt, the morning after panic, it all dissolved. It was real. He was real. This feeling between us was real. A slow smile spread across my face, a genuine, unforced smile of pure, unadulterated joy. He smiled back, a small, quiet smile that reached his eyes, making them crinkle at the corners. We sat like that for a long time, holding hands, drinking our coffee, and watching the sunrise. We didn't need to talk about what came next. We just needed to be here, in this moment, together. The quiet intimacy of it was more profound than any grand declaration. Later that morning, the distant rumble of a truck announced the arrival of the outside world. The power company. A big utility truck, caked in mud, lumbered up the driveway, and two men in bright yellow slickers got out. The return to normalcy, to a world with electricity and other people, felt jarring. I felt a pang of anxiety. Would this break the spell? Would we retreat back into our old roles of employer and employee in the harsh light of day? Cole seemed to sense my unease. He gave my hand a reassuring squeeze before letting it go to stand up. "I'll handle it," he said. He walked over to meet the men, and I watched from the porch. He was back in his element, talking to them in a low, confident voice, pointing out the down line at the end of the driveway. He was competent, in charge. But as he talked, he casually leaned against the porch railing, his body angled slightly back toward me. And when one of the utility workers glanced over at me, a curious look on his face, Cole shifted, placing his hand on the small of my back. It was a subtle, proprietary gesture. A claim. He's with me. It sent a thrill of warmth through my entire body. It was a public act, however small, and it meant the world. An hour later, the power was back on. The refrigerator hummed to life. The digital clocks blinked back into existence. The world was noisy again. The utility truck rumbled away, leaving us alone once more. The test had passed. We were still us. With the power restored, an unspoken question hung in the air. Cole's work was, for all intents and purposes, done. The fence was fixed. The barn was secure. The porch was stable. There was no practical reason for him to stay. My heart twisted at the thought. I had just found him. I couldn't bear the idea of losing him now. He seemed to be thinking the same thing. He walked around the newly repaired porch, testing the railing, his expression thoughtful. I stood in the doorway, my arms crossed, trying to look casual, trying to hide the desperation that was clawing at my insides. He stopped and looked at me. "The job's done," he said, his voice neutral. My heart sank. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my own voice steady. "It is. Thank you, Cole. For everything. I'll write you a check." He just looked at me for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. "There's still the painting," he said. I blinked. "The painting? Inside," he said, nodding toward the house. "You said you wanted to paint the guest room. And the trim in the living room needs a coat." He paused, and a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "That back bedroom gets the morning sun. But a coat of paint would do it good." It wasn't a question of if I still needed a handyman. It wasn't a passionate declaration of love. It was something quieter, and in its own way, something so much better. It was an excuse to stay. It was an offer to build a life, one coat of paint at a time. It was a plan for a future. Tears welled in my eyes, and I blinked them back furiously. "Yeah," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It would." A few days later, we were in that back bedroom. The furniture was covered in drop cloths, and the air smelled of primer and fresh paint. We moved around each other in an easy, comfortable silence. The only sounds the soft squish of the rollers on the walls and our own quiet breathing. He was wearing an old, paint-splattered t-shirt and a pair of worn jeans. There was a smudge of white paint on his cheek. He had moved some of his things into the room. A duffel bag in the corner. A stack of paperback novels on the bedside table. He hadn't officially moved in. We hadn't had that conversation yet. But he hadn't gone home since the night of the storm. We were figuring it out, one day at a time. I paused in my painting, leaning against the wall, and just watched him. He was focused on the tricky trim work around the window, his hands steady, his movements precise. He was a man who knew how to build things, how to make them strong and secure. And he was here, with me, building this. He must have felt my eyes on him, because he stopped and looked over at me. He raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Nothing," I said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across my face. "Just nothing." He smiled back, a real, unguarded smile that lit up his whole face. He put down his paintbrush and walked over to me. He wiped the smudge of paint from his cheek, leaving a faint white streak on his thumb. Then he reached out and gently brushed his thumb across my own cheek. "You had some on you, too," he murmured. He didn't move away. He leaned in and kissed me, a slow, gentle kiss that tasted of latex paint and the promise of 1,000 quiet, ordinary mornings just like this one. His hand moved from my cheek to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. I looked around the half-painted room, at the drop cloths and the cans of paint, at this house that had once been a monument to my loneliness. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the quiet sounds of a shared life, with the presence of this steady, wonderful man. The silence I had bought all those months ago was finally gone, replaced by a peaceful quiet that felt like coming home. I was no longer an observer in my own life. I was a participant, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I was profoundly, breathtakingly happy.